Right now, let's turn our attention to Tom DiLorenzo. He is the author of a great many books, at least a dozen, I would say. The Real Lincoln is the most notorious, but he's also the author of How Capitalism Saved America, Lincoln Unmasked, Hamilton's Curse, and Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. Tom is a professor of economics at the business school at Loyola University in Maryland, and I'm always glad to have a chance to talk to him. Tom DiLorenzo, welcome to the program.
Pleased to be with you, Tom.
Well, as 2013 slips away, so do our opportunities to reflect on the centenary of three hideous institutions. Those would be the Federal Reserve System, the income tax, and the direct election of senators, all of which we date back to the momentous year 1913. The income tax, more or less everybody feels the pinch of that. So let's start there. Where did that all come from? Why was there pressure to have an income tax? Weren't people happy being relatively lightly taxed?
The first federal income tax was during the war to prevent Southern independence, as I call it, during the Lincoln administration. Then that was ended in 1872, but I think it gave the statists a sort of a taste of what could be. They kind of liked having this big giant pot of money. Even, the war was over in 1865, but still for another 6 or 7 years, they had all that income tax revenue to buy votes with. There were dozens of attempts to resurrect the income tax, and we almost did get it during the Grover Cleveland years in the 1880s. But then we finally got it in 1913, the fateful year. One of the contributing factors was the high protectionist tariffs that were the policy of the Republican Party from the Lincoln administration all the way up until 1913. Really disproportionately harmed farmers more than anybody, because everybody had to pay higher prices for things tariff taxes are imposed on. But at the same time, what a tariff does, which is basically a sales tax on imports, is it impoverishes our trading partners. So if people from England cannot sell things in America, well, they do not have the dollars with which to buy things from America. And what were they buying from Americans? Mostly food, mostly agricultural products. So farmers are always hit twice by protectionism. They have to pay the same high prices for clothing and things that we all have to pay higher prices for. And then their business dries up. Their farm overseas. And in the late 19th century, their overseas business in the southern states was still about 60 to 70% of their whole business. And so the farmers of the country became an important voting bloc for an income tax because they were promised, we will take the pressure off you. We will reduce the tariff rate if you, the farmers, organize support for an income tax, which they did. And we were still a very much more of an agricultural economy, certainly, than we are today. And so there was a lot of votes and a lot of money involved in the farm vote. And then, of course, they bait and switched them right after we got the income tax. The Fordney-McCumber tariff came in several years later and increased the tariff rate back up around 22% to 39%. And then in 1930, we had the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was almost 60% on average. And so we ended up with extremely high income tax rates after World War I and a high tariff rate again.
What is it about the income tax that makes it any worse than any other kind of tax? Aren't all taxes oppressive? Is there something uniquely bad about the income tax?
Well, it punishes work, for one thing. It's a tax on work effort and saving and investing, for one thing. It gives the government so much money. Well, I have a whole chapter on the Revolution of 1913 in my book, Hamilton's Curse. During the Lincoln administration, even though he had a sort of a primitive income tax and they had conscription, the government still did not have enough money, really, to enforce conscription very well. But once you got the federal income tax in 1913 and the draft for World War I, well, then you could enforce conscription. You had the means to hire thousands or tens of thousands of conscription police to go and hunt down people who might try to avoid it. It also led to a tremendous centralization of power in Washington, D.C. The original Constitution of America did not give any taxing power to the federal government at all, income or anything else. The states raised all the tax money. And so the income tax did exactly the opposite. It was sort of one of the final nails in the coffin of limited decentralized government in the Jeffersonian tradition, because it gave the government all that money. And you combine that with the Fed And that's how they financed the entry into World War One.
The consequences of the income tax then are not hard, I think, for the average person to get. But I think it is harder for people to understand why it should matter to us what happened with the 17th Amendment, which involved the direct election of senators. So first of all, how did senators used to be elected, and what difference does it make that they changed the manner of electing senators with the 17th Amendment?
Okay, under the original Constitution, the United States senators were appointed by state legislatures, and the purpose of that was so that the people back home, who they were supposed to represent, could have at least some sort of control over their behavior. Founders understood the danger of a representative, a senator, going to the nation's capital and then being influenced by lobbyists rather than the people back home. And this was long before the word lobbyist even existed. And for example, when Andrew Jackson confronted the Bank of the United States, and he eventually defunded the Bank of the United States, which was a precursor of the Fed, there were 7 senators who went to Washington under the promise that they would support Andrew Jackson and oppose the Bank of the United States. But then once they got to Washington, they were easily bribed and bought off by the Bank of the United States. And so and they were all recalled by their legislators back home and fired.
You're fired.
None of this waiting for 5.5 years until the next senatorial election or anything like that. They were fired or forced to resign, what happened. And that was the idea. That's why it was useful to have senators appointed by the state legislatures. It wasn't a perfect system, of course. All politics is corrupt. But when we adopted the 17th Amendment in 1913, that led to the direct election of senators, then, well, that created the system that we have now where they can go and raise money for the senator from Kansas can go to China and raise money from Chinese businessmen to finance his reelection campaign or anywhere on the planet for that matter. And that's exactly what the founding fathers feared, and that's exactly what has happened.
Would it really make much of a difference if the legislators of Maryland chose the senators as opposed to the voters in Maryland at large? I mean, wouldn't they be equally crummy?
Equally crummy, yeah. Well, the main argument that the founders made was that it would be convenient for the legislators to simply fire a senator on the spot. You know, you reneged on your promise to support Andrew Jackson. You're out of here. We're going to send somebody else. Whereas if you have to rely on direct elections, you know, we have the election laws. You have to wait for 5 years for the next election, and in that time, the misbehaving senator could raise tons of money from all his lobbyist special interest supporters to defeat the thing and keep his job.
Do you think the 17th Amendment was introduced because the elites in the United States were deeply concerned that democracy was being thwarted under the old system?
Yeah, that was the basic argument. The god of democracy needed to be supported. And there was a crusade that lasted for decades to do this. It was, from my reading of the history, there were attempts to have direct election of senators for many decades prior to 1913. And, of course, this was the progressive era. And so under the progressive era, democracy became a god with a small g. And that sort of held the day, and that's how we got it.
Well, the third of these ingredients is maybe the most important because the least understood and the least talked about, and that's the Federal Reserve System. Is there any evidence that there was any attempt on the part of policymakers or bankers to try to foster the common good by giving us a stable currency that would be overseen by a central bank and so on?
No, that's another one of the sort of the curses of the progressive era was this idea that government regulation is in the public interest. The founding generation would be horrified that this sort of a widely accepted idea that government acts in the public interest. You know, we went from James Madison's warning that men are not angels, that's why we need a constitution, to this idea that, well, yeah, men are angels if they're in politics, and so they serve the public interest. And so I guess if you repeat that enough in the schools and in the culture, you get a majority of the people to believe in that line, you can get away with all these things. It's every politician's dream is to have a legal counterfeiting operation that only he can operate. You and I can't do it. We can go to prison for it. But the politicians have a legal counterfeiting operation that they can use to buy votes. monetary economist George Selgin, who's an Austrian school economist, has a very good speech that's on the webs on YouTube. He's given it on several occasions.
The Fed is not just a failure in our terms, but a failure in its own terms and in those of the mainstream economics profession.
He looks in a very scholarly way at the promises that the supporters of the Fed make, that it produces price stability, economic stability in general, and it lowers unemployment. And he found that on every score, the opposite is true, that after the Fed, we had worse business cycles. And on the price stability front, we do have some statistics on prices that go back several hundred years. There's a publication called Historical Statistics of the United States that economic researchers use, and it shows that the price level, the CPI, if you will, was basically the same in 1913 as it was in 1789, the year the Constitution was ratified. But since then, since 1913, it's gone up by more than 20 times. And so it's really a sort of a ridiculous joke to talk about the Fed as conducive to price stability. And even Professor Romer from UC Berkeley, who was an Obama administration economist, one of the things she is known for in her academic research is showing that the Fed actually made business cycles more unstable compared to the monetary system that existed from the end of the Civil War until we got the Fed. Christina Romer is who I'm talking about.
So we put this all together then. We put together the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, and the Federal Reserve, and the result is much more centralized government with far greater powers. Is there any scenario that you can envision that involves the reversal of any of this?
Well, the Fed and the income tax gives the federal government so much power with so much money, and then the 17th Amendment is just one of the many tools that Congress uses to make it almost impossible to unseat an incumbent. That, along with gerrymandering, means that is the main reasons why we have this situation where for about the past 50 years, the average reelection rate is 80% at minimum in the Senate and even higher in the House of Representatives, which is why for many years I've been saying the only real hope is secession, peaceful secession, which is the way in which the Soviet republics escaped the clutches of the Soviet Union. And if that can never happen in the United States, then I really don't see any way out of it apart from an utter collapse of the dollar and of the economy, and a fundamental change in the chaos of all of that. But peaceful secession would be a much preferred scenario in my view.